They control every central bank on Earth. They've orchestrated every major war for the past 2 centuries. They possess more wealth than entire nations and pull the strings of world leaders like marionettes. When you pay taxes, buy groceries, or fill up your car with gas, a portion of that money flows directly into their coffers. They are the puppet masters of global finance, the shadow rulers of human civilization, the most powerful family in the history of the world. At least, that's what millions of people believe about the Rothschilds. The reality is far stranger than the conspiracy theories, and infinitely more fascinating, because the true story of the Rothschild family reveals something profound about human nature, the power of myth, and how legends can become more influential than the people who inspired them. This is the story of how 5 brothers from a Jewish ghetto in Frankfurt became the most successful bankers in European history, how they lost that dominance to forces they never saw coming, and how their name became synonymous with conspiracy theories that have shaped politics, fueled genocides, and continue to influence world events today. But first, let's talk about what people actually believe about the Rothschilds, because these beliefs have become far more powerful than any bank account. According to the conspiracy theories, the Rothschild family controls the central banks of virtually every country on Earth. They supposedly manipulate currencies, orchestrate economic crashes, and profit from human misery on an unimaginable scale. They're accused of starting wars to increase government debt, assassinating presidents who oppose them, and maintaining a stranglehold over global media to hide their activities from public scrutiny. The numbers thrown around are staggering. Conspiracy theorists claim the family controls anywhere from $500 billion to $500 trillion in assets. They're supposedly behind everything from the Federal Reserve to the European Central Bank, from the International Monetary Fund to the World Bank. Every major financial institution, according to these theories, is either owned by the Rothschilds or operates under their control. These aren't fringe beliefs held by a handful of extremists. Polls consistently show that significant percentages of people in countries around the world believe some version of Rothschild conspiracy theories. In the United States, roughly 20% of adults believe that a small group of wealthy families, often specifically naming the Rothschilds, secretly controls the global economy. In Europe, the numbers are even higher in some countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, where anti-Semitic conspiracy theories have deep historical roots. The theories have been embraced by political movements across the spectrum. Far-right groups portray the Rothschilds as the architects of multiculturalism and mass immigration, secretly working to destroy Western civilization. Far-left activists see them as the ultimate symbols of capitalist exploitation, the puppet masters behind American imperialism and corporate globalization. Islamic extremists blame them for everything from the creation of Israel to the invasion of Iraq. The theories are so adaptable that they can be molded to fit almost any political grievance or social anxiety. Social media has supercharged these beliefs, creating echo chambers where conspiracy theorists can share increasingly elaborate theories about Rothschild manipulation. YouTube videos claiming to expose their secret activities regularly receive millions of views. Facebook groups dedicated to discussing their supposed crimes have hundreds of thousands of members. The family name appears in conspiracy theories about everything from the COVID-19 pandemic to climate change, from cryptocurrency markets to space exploration. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable. Almost everything people believe about the Rothschilds is either completely false or wildly exaggerated. The family that millions of people fear as the secret rulers of the world economy hasn't been a dominant force in global finance for over a century. Their current wealth, while substantial, wouldn't even place them among the top 50 richest families in the world. They don't control central banks, manipulate currencies, or orchestrate world events. They're successful investment bankers, operating in a highly regulated, transparent financial system that bears no resemblance to the shadowy world of 19th century European finance. The gap between perception and reality is so vast that it seems almost impossible to bridge. But understanding how this gap developed requires going back to the beginning, to a time when the Rothschild name actually did carry the kind of power that conspiracy theorists imagine it still possesses today. The story begins in the late 18th century, in the cramped Jewish quarter of Frankfurt, Germany. This was a world of severe restrictions and limited opportunities for Jewish families. They were confined to a ghetto, forbidden from owning land, excluded from most professions, and subject to discriminatory taxes and regulations that made economic advancement nearly impossible. It was in this environment of systematic oppression that Mayer Amschel Rothschild began building what would become the most successful banking dynasty in European history. Mayer Amschel wasn't born into wealth or privilege. His father was a small-time money changer and trader in rare coins, operating from a tiny shop in the Frankfurt ghetto. When his parents died, leaving him orphaned at 13, young Mayer was sent to work as an apprentice at a banking house in Hanover. It was there that he learned the fundamentals of finance, developed connections with European nobility, and began to understand how money and power intersected in the complex world of 18th-century politics. But Mayer Amschel possessed something that set him apart from other ambitious young men of his era, an almost supernatural ability to understand how information could be converted into profit. In an age before telegraphs, telephones, or rapid transportation, news traveled slowly and unreliably. The merchant who knew about a military victory, a political crisis, or an economic opportunity before his competitors could make enormous profits by acting on that information quickly. Mayer Amschel built his early fortune by establishing a network of correspondents across Europe who would send him information about political developments, military movements, and economic conditions. He cultivated relationships with minor German princes, providing them with rare coins and financial services in exchange for access to court gossip and political intelligence. He understood that in the fragmented world of 18th-century Europe, where dozens of small states were constantly forming and breaking alliances, information was the most valuable commodity of all. The breakthrough came during the Napoleonic Wars, when European governments desperately needed financing for their military campaigns. Traditional sources of funding were inadequate for the massive scale of modern warfare, and governments were forced to turn to private bankers who could provide the enormous sums required to maintain armies in the field. Mayer Amschel recognized this opportunity and positioned his family to become the premier financiers of European governments. His masterstroke was sending his 5 sons to establish banking houses in the major financial centers of Europe. Nathan went to London, James to Paris, Karl to Naples, Solomon to Vienna, and Amschel remained in Frankfurt. This created an unprecedented international network that could move money, information, and influence across national boundaries, with remarkable speed and efficiency. The family's rise to prominence was meteoric. By 1815, they were financing governments across Europe, facilitating international trade, and accumulating wealth on a scale that dwarfed their competitors. Nathan Rothschild in London became so influential that his opinion on government bonds could determine their market value. James de Rothschild in Paris was consulted by French ministers on matters of economic policy. The family had achieved something that seemed impossible just a generation earlier. They had transcended the limitations of their origins and become power brokers on the European stage. But it was their handling of information during the Battle of Waterloo that created the legend that would eventually consume them. According to the story that has been told and retold for over 2 centuries, Nathan Rothschild received news of Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo a full day before the British government learned the outcome. Using this advanced knowledge, he supposedly manipulated the London bond market, first selling British government bonds to create panic and drive down prices, then buying them back at rock-bottom rates when other investors thought Britain had lost the war. When news of Wellington's victory finally reached London, British bonds soared in value, and Nathan Rothschild made what some estimates suggest was the equivalent of over $1 billion in today's money in a single day. The story became the foundation of the Rothschild legend, a family so well-informed and so ruthlessly efficient that they could profit from the most important military victory in European history, while everyone else remained in the dark. The supposed puppet masters of global finance weren't even invited to the meeting when this legend was born. Because here's the thing about the Waterloo story, it's almost certainly false. Modern historians have found no evidence that Nathan Rothschild received advance news of the battle's outcome, no records of the massive bond transactions that supposedly made him rich, and no contemporary accounts that support the dramatic version of events that became part of Rothschild mythology. But the truth didn't matter. The story was too perfect, too compelling, too useful as an explanation for how Jewish bankers could accumulate such enormous wealth and influence. It spread across Europe and became the template for every subsequent conspiracy theory about Rothschild manipulation. The idea that they possessed superior information networks, that they profited from human suffering, that they manipulated markets for their own benefit, All of these themes can be traced back to the Waterloo legend. What actually happened was both more mundane and more impressive than the myth. The Rothschilds did become incredibly wealthy during the Napoleonic period, but they did it through careful planning, superior organization, and genuine financial innovation. They developed new methods for international money transfers, created more efficient systems for government bond trading, and established correspondent relationships that allowed them to operate across national boundaries with unprecedented effectiveness. By 1825, the Rothschild banks were handling a significant portion of international government financing. They were involved in funding the construction of railways across Europe, financing mining operations in South America, and facilitating trade between countries that had been economic enemies just years earlier. Their wealth was real, their influence was substantial, and their impact on European economic development was genuinely transformative. But the myths about their power were already growing faster than their actual achievements. Every successful investment was attributed to secret knowledge or market manipulation. Every government that borrowed money from Rothschild banks was assumed to be under their control. Every political development that benefited their business interests was seen as evidence of their hidden influence over European affairs. The family found themselves trapped in a paradox that would define their legacy. The more successful they became, the more people suspected them of achieving that success through illegitimate means. Their very competence became evidence of conspiracy. Their international network, which was simply good business practice, was interpreted as proof of a plot to control European governments. Their wealth, which had been earned through financial innovation and calculated risk-taking, was seen as the result of manipulation and exploitation. Then everything changed. The world that had made the Rothschilds wealthy and powerful was about to be transformed by forces that would make their 19th-century dominance seem quaint and old-fashioned. New technologies, new forms of wealth creation, and new centers of economic power were emerging that would challenge everything the Rothschilds thought they understood about how money and influence worked. The Industrial Revolution was creating entirely new categories of wealth based on manufacturing, resource extraction, and technological innovation. The expansion of global trade was opening up markets that dwarfed the European government bond business that had made the Rothschilds rich. Most importantly, the rise of American capitalism was about to demonstrate that the Rothschilds, for all their supposed omniscience, had completely missed the most important economic development of the 19th century. The stage was set for the most ironic reversal in financial history. Just as millions of people were becoming convinced that the Rothschilds secretly controlled the world economy, the Rothschild empire was about to be blindsided by competitors who would make their wealth and influence look insignificant by comparison. Then everything changed. Just as millions of Europeans were becoming convinced that the Rothschilds secretly controlled the world, the Rothschild empire was about to be completely blindsided by a force they never saw coming. And it wasn't another European power. It wasn't a government or a revolution. It was something far more devastating. American capitalism on steroids. Picture this. While European conspiracy theorists were obsessing over Rothschild influence, a group of American industrialists was quietly building business empires that would make the Rothschilds look like corner shop owners. We're talking about wealth accumulation on a scale that was literally unprecedented in human history. And the Rothschilds, for all their supposed omniscience, completely missed it. The year 1865 didn't just mark the end of the American Civil War. It marked the beginning of the most explosive period of wealth creation the world had ever seen. While the Rothschilds were still thinking like 18th-century merchants, financing government bonds and international trade, American titans were about to rewrite the rules of what it meant to be rich. J.P. Morgan wasn't just building a bank. He was creating an industrial empire so vast that he would personally own more railroad track than some countries had territory. When the U.S. government faced a financial crisis in 1895, it wasn't the Rothschilds they called. It was Morgan who single-handedly saved the American economy, providing $65 million in gold reserves from his personal fortune. The supposed puppet masters of global finance weren't even invited to the meeting. Andrew Carnegie wasn't just making steel, he was revolutionizing manufacturing on a scale that made European industry look medieval. By 1900, Carnegie's steel company alone was producing more steel than the entire British Empire. When he sold his company to Morgan in 1901, the sale price was $480 million, equivalent to over $15 billion today. That was more than the GDP of most European nations, but the most mind-blowing example was John D. Rockefeller. This man didn't just dominate the oil industry. He achieved something that would have been impossible in Europe: a complete monopoly over an entire sector of the American economy. Standard Oil controlled 90% of American oil production and distribution. Rockefeller's personal wealth peaked at over $400 billion in today's money, making him arguably the richest person in human history. What made this story truly insane was that while conspiracy theorists were convinced that the Rothschilds controlled global finance, these American titans were actually doing what the conspiracy theorists imagined the Rothschilds were doing. They were manipulating markets, controlling governments, and accumulating power on a scale that dwarfed anything the Rothschilds had ever achieved. And they were doing it completely openly, in broad daylight, while everyone was looking the other way. The numbers were so staggering they seemed fictional. By 1900, the combined wealth of America's top industrialists exceeded the GDP of the entire European continent. The center of global finance had shifted across the Atlantic so completely that European banks were now competing for scraps from the American table. And the Rothschilds, who had once been the undisputed masters of international finance, were suddenly just another regional banking house trying to stay relevant. But what made this reversal truly devastating was the technology that was destroying their competitive advantage. The telegraph, which had eliminated their monopoly on fast communication, was now carrying anti-Semitic propaganda across continents at the speed of light. The same newspapers that were reporting on American industrial dominance were also publishing elaborate theories about secret Rothschild control. The less power they actually had, the more power they were credited with by their critics. Every technological advance that weakened their business empire strengthened the conspiracy theories about their supposed dominance. The less control they actually had, the more control they were credited with by their critics. And then came the most devastating blow of all. The fundamental nature of wealth itself was changing. The Rothschilds had built their fortune in an era when money meant gold, when wealth was measured in government bonds and international trade. But the Industrial Revolution was creating entirely new forms of value based on manufacturing capacity, technological innovation, and resource extraction. While the Rothschilds were still thinking about financing governments, American industrialists were building the infrastructure of the modern world. They weren't just rich. They were creating the systems that would define how wealth worked for the next century. Oil pipelines, steel mills, railroad networks, electrical grids, telegraph systems. These weren't just businesses. They were the foundation of industrial civilization. The Rothschilds tried to adapt, but their response was tragically inadequate. They established new offices, invested in railways, financed mining operations. Lionel de Rothschild personally provided the £4 million that allowed the British government to purchase shares in the Suez Canal Company, securing Britain's route to India. The French Rothschilds became major investors in Russian oil fields and South African diamond mines. These were impressive achievements by any normal standard. But they weren't enough. By 1880, the Rothschilds' share of international finance had declined so dramatically that they were no longer even among the top 10 financial institutions in the world. New competitors were emerging everywhere, often with better technology, more flexible business practices, and deeper understanding of the new industrial economy. What happened next defied all logic. As the Rothschilds' real influence collapsed, the conspiracy theories about their power reached new heights of sophistication and malevolence. The decline of their actual dominance coincided perfectly with the rise of a new, more dangerous form of antisemitism that would have consequences beyond anything the family could have imagined. This wasn't the crude religious prejudice of earlier centuries. This was pseudoscientific racial theory combined with elaborate political conspiracy that appealed to educated, middle-class audiences. Writers like Édouard Drumont in France weren't ignorant peasants. They were sophisticated intellectuals who presented detailed financial analyses, charts, graphs, and political theory that seemed to prove their claims about Jewish conspiracy. Drumont's book, Jewish France, became a bestseller across Europe, selling over 100,000 copies in its first year. It was translated into multiple languages and inspired imitators in every European country. What made these arguments particularly lethal was their academic veneer. They looked like serious scholarship, complete with footnotes and statistical analysis. The Rothschilds became the central villains in these new conspiracy theories, portrayed as the masterminds of a plot so vast and so evil that it defied comprehension. According to these theories, every war, every revolution, every economic crisis was orchestrated by the Rothschilds for their own profit. They were accused of deliberately starting conflicts, manipulating currencies, and controlling governments through debt. The most chilling aspect was how these theories adapted to contemporary events. When the Franco-Prussian War broke out in 1870, both sides were supposedly financed by different branches of the Rothschild family, profiting from Christian bloodshed. When economic depression struck, they were blamed on Rothschild manipulation. When new technologies emerged, they were portrayed as tools of Jewish control. By 1890, millions of Europeans had been exposed to some version of these conspiracy theories. The same mass media that was undermining the Rothschilds' business advantages was spreading myths about their supposed power to audiences that had never seen a Rothschild bank or met a member of the family. The gap between reality and perception had become so wide that facts seemed irrelevant. The family that had once possessed genuine influence over European governments was now credited with controlling events they had no involvement in whatsoever. They were simultaneously losing their actual power and gaining mythical omnipotence in the minds of their critics. But the most terrifying development was yet to come. These conspiracy theories were about to be discovered by political movements that would weaponize them in ways that 19th-century anti-Semites had never imagined. The Rothschild myths were about to become the ideological foundation for some of the most horrific crimes in human history. While millions of people feared Rothschild control, the Rothschilds were busy getting their asses kicked by American capitalism. The stage was set for the final transformation, from successful bankers to scapegoats, from financial innovators to the eternal villains of humanity's darkest conspiracy theories. The myths had taken on a life of their own, and they were about to prove far more durable and far more dangerous than the empire that had inspired them. The year 1903 should have been just another year in the slow decline of Rothschild influence. Instead, it became the moment when centuries of anti-Semitic resentment crystallized into the most dangerous document in human history. In the basement offices of the Russian secret police, a group of Tsarist agents was cobbling together a forgery that would eventually lead to the deaths of millions of people. They called it the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and it would transform the Rothschild name from a symbol of banking success into a weapon of mass murder. The protocols weren't even original. They were a crude plagiarism of earlier anti-Semitic works, stitched together by incompetent forgers who couldn't even keep their story straight. But what they lacked in creativity, they made up for in pure, concentrated evil. The document claimed that Jewish leaders met in secret to plan the destruction of Christian civilization and the establishment of Jewish world domination. And at the center of this imaginary conspiracy were the Rothschilds, portrayed as the financial masterminds orchestrating humanity's enslavement. What made this story so devastating was timing. The protocols appeared just as the world was entering the most chaotic period in human history. World War I was about to tear Europe apart. The Russian Revolution would topple centuries-old empires. Economic depression would devastate entire nations. People were desperate for explanations, for someone to blame, for simple answers to impossibly complex problems. The protocols provided all of that, wrapped in the compelling narrative of secret Jewish conspiracy. The documents spread like a virus across the globe, translated into dozens of languages, and adapted to local prejudices. In Germany, it explained the country's humiliating defeat in World War I. In the United States, it was promoted by Henry Ford, who published excerpts in his newspaper and distributed over 500,000 copies. In the Middle East, it justified opposition to Jewish immigration. In Russia, it provided ideological cover for continued pogroms against Jewish communities. But the most catastrophic adoption came in Germany during the 1920s, when a failed Austrian artist named Adolf Hitler discovered the propaganda value of Rothschild conspiracy theories. Hitler understood something that previous anti-Semites had missed. These theories weren't just useful for explaining problems. They were weapons that could be used to seize power and justify almost any atrocity. In Mein Kampf, Hitler wrote extensively about Jewish financial manipulation, drawing heavily on the mythology that had grown up around the Rothschild name. He portrayed them as the puppet masters of international capitalism, the secret rulers who had orchestrated Germany's defeat and humiliation. The Nazis would transform these conspiracy theories into the ideological foundation for the Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews. The insanity was staggering. By the time Hitler came to power in 1933, the Rothschilds' actual influence had declined to almost nothing. The family that had once dominated European finance was now just one banking house among many, their power diminished by American competition, technological change, and the rise of new financial centers. They couldn't even protect themselves from the very conspiracy theories that had made them famous. But in the Nazi imagination, they remained the ultimate villains, the secret rulers of the world economy. The Nazi propaganda machine turned the Rothschild name into a symbol of everything they claimed to oppose. The 1940 film The Rothschilds portrayed the family as scheming manipulators who profited from European wars and Christian suffering. The movie was shown to millions of Germans, including SS officers who would later participate in the Holocaust. Nazi newspapers published elaborate charts showing supposed Rothschild control over banks, governments, and media organizations. School textbooks taught German children that the Rothschilds were the enemies of the German people, the architects of their nation's humiliation. Children as young as 6 were learning to hate a family they would never meet for crimes they had never committed. The consequences were beyond horrific. Members of the Rothschild family who remained in Nazi-occupied Europe faced persecution, imprisonment, and death. Their banks were seized, their properties confiscated, their priceless art collections looted by Nazi officials. The Austrian branch of the family was forced to sell their bank to the Nazis for a fraction of its value before fleeing the country. Louis de Rothschild, head of the Austrian branch, was arrested by the Nazis immediately after the Anschluss in 1938. He was imprisoned for over a year, tortured and humiliated, before finally being released after his family paid the largest ransom in history, $21 million in today's money, plus the surrender of all their Austrian assets. The family that conspiracy theorists claimed controlled Hitler couldn't even get him to return their phone calls. But even as the real Rothschilds suffered under Nazi persecution, even as their family members were murdered in concentration camps, the myths about their power continued to spread. The conspiracy theories had achieved something truly terrifying. They had become completely independent of reality. They no longer needed actual Rothschild influence to sustain themselves. They fed on fear, hatred, and the human need for simple explanations to complex problems. After World War II, as the full horror of the Holocaust became known, explicit antisemitism became socially unacceptable in much of the Western world. But the Rothschild conspiracy theories didn't die. They evolved, like a virus adapting to new hosts. The language changed, but the underlying structure remained identical. A secretive group of financial elites was manipulating world events for their own benefit. During the Cold War, the theories took on new forms that were even more insidious, because they seemed more respectable. In the Soviet Union, the Rothschilds were portrayed as the capitalist puppet masters behind Western imperialism. Soviet propaganda films showed them as the secret rulers of Wall Street, manipulating American foreign policy for their own profit. In the developing world, they were blamed for economic exploitation and political interference, the hidden hand behind every Western intervention. In the United States, they became central figures in conspiracy theories about the Federal Reserve, international banking, and global governance. Books like Gary Allen's None Dare Call It Conspiracy introduced Rothschild conspiracy theories to millions of Americans, claiming the family was part of a broader plot involving the Illuminati, the Freemasons, and various secret societies working to establish a new world order. The 1960s and 1970s saw an explosion of new Rothschild conspiracy theories from both the far left and the far right. Radical leftists portrayed them as symbols of capitalist exploitation, the ultimate example of how wealth corrupts democracy. Far-right groups saw them as agents of international communism, secretly funding revolutionary movements to destabilize Western civilization. The theories were completely contradictory, but they shared a common thread. The Rothschilds were evil, and they were responsible for everything wrong with the world. Then the internet arrived, and the crazy went nuclear. Suddenly, every basement-dwelling conspiracy theorist could prove the Rothschilds controlled everything from your morning coffee to the weather. The family that couldn't even maintain their own banking dominance was now supposedly running a global weather machine, The theories became increasingly divorced from reality. The Rothschilds were now accused of controlling everything from climate change policy to vaccine development, from cryptocurrency markets to space exploration. They were supposedly behind every major news event, every political scandal, every economic crisis. The internet had created an echo chamber where conspiracy theorists could reinforce each other's delusions without ever encountering contradictory evidence. What made these modern conspiracy theories particularly dangerous was their ability to adapt to contemporary fears. During the 2008 financial crisis, the Rothschilds were blamed for market manipulation and predatory lending. During the COVID-19 pandemic, they were accused of engineering the virus to increase their control over global populations. During political upheavals, they were portrayed as the puppet masters orchestrating regime changes for their own benefit. The persistence of these theories reveals something truly disturbing about human nature. The Rothschild myths have survived for over 2 centuries not because they're true, but because they serve psychological needs that have nothing to do with the actual Rothschild family. They provide simple explanations for complex problems, scapegoats for systemic failures, and a sense of hidden knowledge that makes believers feel special and informed. Today, the Rothschild conspiracy theories continue to spread on social media platforms, finding new audiences among people who have never heard of the family's actual history. They've become part of a broader ecosystem of conspiracy theories that includes QAnon, flat Earth beliefs, and anti-vaccine movements. The family name that once represented the pinnacle of European banking has become a universal symbol for hidden power and secret manipulation. The real Rothschilds, meanwhile, continue to operate their businesses, much diminished from their 19th century peak but still active in investment banking and wealth management. They are wealthy, certainly, but they're not the puppet masters that conspiracy theorists imagine them to be. They're business people operating in a highly regulated, transparent financial system that bears no resemblance to the shadowy world of 19th century European banking. The less actual power the Rothschilds possess, the more power they're credited with by conspiracy theorists. The more transparent the global financial system becomes, the more elaborate the theories about secret manipulation grow. The more evidence historians provide about the family's actual history, the more convinced conspiracy theorists become that the truth is being hidden from them. This is the ultimate tragedy of the Rothschild story. A family that once possessed genuine influence over European politics and finance has become far more powerful as symbols than they ever were in reality. Not powerful in any real sense, but powerful as explanations, as scapegoats, as the eternal villains in humanity's most enduring and dangerous conspiracy theories. The myths have not only outlived the empire that inspired them, they've become more destructive than the empire ever was. The Rothschild conspiracy theories have contributed to pogroms, genocides, and countless acts of violence against innocent people. They continue to poison political discourse, fuel antisemitism, and provide ideological cover for extremist movements around the world. The Rothschild name will likely continue to appear in conspiracy theories for generations to come, long after the last member of the family has retired from banking, long after their actual business activities have been forgotten. They have achieved a kind of immortality, not as successful entrepreneurs or philanthropists, but as the eternal villains of the conspiracy theory universe, forever blamed for problems they didn't create and credited with power they never possessed. So the next time someone tells you the Rothschilds control the world, remember this: the most successful conspiracy in history wasn't carried out by the Rothschilds. It was carried out against them. And it's still working.